Thank you so much for that welcome, and I'm really honored and privileged to be speaking to you today. It's my pleasure. As Kevin said, I'm going to focus on the 1874 Black Hills Expedition, a subject I've been looking at since just before Y2K. I can't believe it's been that long either. I've been doing lots of different kinds of photography in my career, but something that I came upon with this subject of the expedition almost 25 years ago was the idea of setting my camera where somebody else did a long time ago and trying to match that and looking at the changes and similarities, trying to learn about history, learn a little bit about the environment. There's all kinds of things you can, that other experts in other fields can maybe pull out of these pictures, so I really enjoy that. And I get asked, how do you find these sites? And I didn't invent this technique, but it's something I've kind of tried to refine over the last couple of decades. And so I look for the background of a picture, and then, I take my computer out there. Now I take my computer out there. It was on film 25 years ago, and look for the background, and then you can usually work your way to the foreground by shooting a comparison photo that you hope matches up, and then you move if you have to adjust that. This is up by Sylvan Lake, where they used to have a ski jump, believe it or not, back in the 1930s for a while. So we're looking at Black Elk Peak there off in the distance. I just shot this a couple months ago for a forthcoming project. So this idea of repeat photography, or re-photography as it's sometimes called, has become the subject of several books, and these are almost entirely supported by the purchases of readers and bookshops and so on. We really appreciate that. The Historical Society also carries some of our books, and you're looking at my wife Camille there, who's fortunately for me a graphic designer, and she puts the graphics together on the computer. We send these to a printer and make our way in the world, but we couldn't do it without the support of folks who have bought our books, and I've spoken to a couple of those this morning already. I really do appreciate that. Along with that, I have to commend my co-authors, especially on these two books on the Custer expedition that I'll speak about. John Nelson on the left there from Rapid City, and Ernie Graffey on the right were my co-authors on these two books. A lot of what I'm going to share with you this morning is their work as well. I want to be really clear about that. Well, going back to the last century, there was a famous book that some of you are probably familiar with from South Dakota State University called Yellow Ore, Yellow Hair, Yellow Pine, a photographic study of a century of forest ecology. And this was put out by South Dakota State University, and it was my introduction to the Custer expedition. And I think for a lot of people it probably was, and I still have people ask me about this book, 50 years after it was originally published. It really was groundbreaking for its time. So this is when they first looked for some of these photo sites from the Custer expedition back in the 1970s, and then shot a new picture, I think in around 1972 for publication a couple of years later. And I got to speak to Dr. Pergulski. Donald Pergulski was the lead author. He was in his 90s at that time, around 2000, 2001. We had a phone call, and he was glad to hear somebody else was taking this up again, after 25 years, and encouraged me to do that. He said he started looking for these sites in the 1950s out in the Black Hills on vacation with his family, just kind of, wandering around with a pile of photos that he'd gotten from Pierre, no doubt, from the state archives, and looking for these sites. And he didn't have a lot of the advantages that I'll share with you shortly that helped us find additional sites that they couldn't find back in the 1970s. And he worked with Richard Soule, who was the photographer over at SDSU. So they did a fabulous job, and we're building, of course, on the work that they started with our book, Exploring with Custer. So Exploring with Custer first came out in 2002. We had a couple of updates, there were a couple of typos and photos we wanted to change and so on, just a couple of things there. But by 2005, it was kind of fixed, and we reprinted a couple of times since then. But around 2018, I started talking to Ernie Graffey about the possibility of updating it as we approached the 150th anniversary of this expedition, and a lot of things had changed in the Black Hills, and we had learned a few things about the history, and we had some new technology that we could apply to this. So in June of 2023, just last year, we issued this revised 4th edition, which is quite a substantial update, I think, to the earlier book. And just for those of you who haven't heard of this before, and I know there's a few out there, believe me, still, this is focused on the Black Hills part of their journey, that section of the trip only. We did do a second book in 2009 called Crossing the Plains with Custer, which is less known even, but does cover the rest of that trail to and from the Black Hills across the plains. So that's worth looking at if you happen to enjoy the earlier edition. So what's new? We updated almost every page. We added 36 pages. We got scans of the original glass negatives, working with Matthew Reitzel at the archives here, and those are fabulous, as we're going to see, compared to what we had available 20-some years ago. I went back and re-photographed all the photo sites again in 2020, using those scans as well as the other information we had. And because of digital photography and because I've had a few years to practice this technique, I was able to shoot them on the same day that Illingworth did back in 1874. So that was quite an exciting process, and took a lot of arrangement up front to get that accomplished. There's some private landowners I needed to contact and so on. But we also got some new sources since 2002 when our first book came out, a first edition, a new diary, and some information about the Indian Scouts and so on. And then, again, technology marches on. GPS got more accurate than it was in 2001 and 2002. And so we've gone over the whole trail again, Ernie and I, and re-verified all of our readings with GPS. And a big part of this book is being able to guide yourself along the trail if you choose to do that, or you can just read about it in your armchair. But we do have that data in there if you want to follow this route and go to the photo sites across the Black Hills. And then there were some land ownership changes, and we found some new discoveries as we were working on this over a period of about 2 or 3 years here, leading up to the publication in 2023. So, well, what was this expedition? I'll just go over the basics here. Not everybody is familiar with it. Maybe you've just heard about it in the periphery. So in 1874, this huge wagon train came down to the Black Hills to explore and map. And one diary kind of explains the basic reason was that the map for the Black Hills was blank, as this Private Ewert wrote in his diary that we accessed for this. But that's not quite true. There were maps of the Black Hills. They did have some big white spots on them, though, where no white people had ever gone. Certainly the natives had been through there many times. But another official rationale was General Sheridan, Custer's superior, thought that the Lakota were using the Black Hills as sort of a base to make raids down into Nebraska and elsewhere, causing trouble, of course, for the whites who were coming into the country at that time. So he got permission from President Grant to send this expedition to the Black Hills, as he writes in a report to Congress a year later. But under that official reason, there's definitely talk of whether gold might be found or not in the Black Hills well ahead of the expedition leaving. The newspapers are full of stories wondering, will Custer find gold? We hope he finds gold. We've had this panic in 1873, or a depression, that this would help us get past that if we could find gold again, get another gold strike going. So that's definitely part of this story on an unofficial basis, at least, if as part of that story. Little problem, though. There's this 1868 Fort Laramie Treaty that the U.S. government and the Senate had ratified, signed with the Lakota, promising them what is now most of western South Dakota and the Black Hills for their exclusive use. And we're still going over this today, of course, and as we should. There is some language in there allowing officers, agents, employees of the government, as may be authorized, to pass over the treaty lands. And again, I don't know if this is what they had in mind when they wrote that line, but we all know what a terrible outcome that had for the Lakota and the other tribes in this area. But this is our history. These guys went right past my driveway, basically north of Custer, and so I continue to study it. I'm interested in it, but we try to be sympathetic to those other parts of history as well. Who came with Custer in 1874? A couple of years before the Little Bighorn, 995 men. A woman named Sarah Campbell. This was a black woman who worked for the sutler on this expedition, and we've got a lot more about her in the book. 70 Indian scouts. These were mostly Arikara and Ree Indians, traditional enemies of the Lakota. So they're scouting for the Army and helping the Army find their way into Lakota territory here. And more importantly, a number of them had been to the Black Hills in the past, so they knew how to get there. And they were coming from 300 miles away. So as one of them here is literally pointing at the map, showing the way to Custer there. But in this picture, There were 5 newspaper reporters, so we've got a lot of firsthand information, and it's almost like a play-by-play the way some of them write, hour by hour in some cases out in the Black Hills. They're writing about what's happened, what the experiences are, the discovery of gold, of course, and other things like that. So those are really good sources that we put into the book. A couple of miners, Horatio Ross and William McKay, and were attached to the expedition, apparently with Custer's full knowledge and blessing. And they did find gold. Little spoiler alert, 3 miles east of the town of Custer is where the gold discovery was officially made. Again, more about that in the book or later on here. There was a team of map makers under a man named Captain Ludlow, and he's kind of I think he's the smartest guy on this expedition. He's the guy we would most like to talk to. You don't hear much about him, but he did some brilliant work with the map, as we'll see, that helps us today guide ourselves along this trail even after 150 years. And then several scientists studying the rocks, the plants, the geology, fossils, that sort of thing. And all of this is going to go into an official report to Congress a year later. And of course, the photographer, William Henry Illingworth of St. Paul, Minnesota, was invited along and paid a teamster's salary. And he has this wagon that we see in a number of the pictures off in the distance or close up that we can pick out, because it looks a little different than the typical covered wagons that they had, which they had about 110 covered wagons carrying all the supplies they would need for this 2-month expedition. And each wagon being pulled by 6 mules, so we figure roughly 700 mules with some spares and about 800 horses ridden by the 10 companies of cavalry. So it's quite an operation, and if you've had horses or mules, you know how much they can eat in a day, and so you really needed to think about that as you were setting up camp. Was there enough grass for all those animals, as well as water and wood? And they didn't have all of those things a lot of times, out on the prairie especially. And then they were very well armed. They had a cannon, 3 Gatling guns. Everybody had the new Springfield 45, 55 rifles and carbines. The new .45 Colt revolver had been issued to this expedition for the first time in the field in 1874. But on this expedition, and I'm not a huge fan of Custer the man. People ask me about his psychology and so on, and that's not something I'm particularly interested in. But and I'm not defending what he did before or after this expedition. He had some other chapters in his life. But in this particular instance, he was not trying to make war on the Dakota or anybody else. He really was just in this mode of exploring. He went out of his way at one point up in the Black Hills to try to not alarm this group of Lakota that they came across, and didn't completely succeed, because that wagon train coming at you must have looked kind of alarming. And so in any case, there's a lot more about that in the book, but this was definitely a different mode for him, this particular expedition. And then just to keep things a little lighter, he had a 16-piece brass band along, which you can see this trooper here carrying his horn on the back of his horse there, ready for action. The band would play when camp was being set up in the evening, or at other times when people were under labor. So the wagon train would get stopped by an obstacle, trees in the way, rocks in the way, need to make a bridge, and they would stop, and a bunch of men would come forward and start doing whatever needed to be done, and then the band would play to entertain them as well as everybody else. So, well, they came from this place, Fort Abraham Lincoln. This is up in present-day North Dakota, south of Mandan there on the Missouri River. And it looks like this today. It's a state park now. Wonderful visit up there if they have a nice museum and a lot of interpretation about the Indian Wars, as well as the native tribes, the Hidatsa, the Mandan, the Arikara, that lived on the Missouri River prior to the fort being established. So really, really interesting. But that's way up in this corner of this expedition area map here, up by Bismarck, North Dakota, there across the river. We're in kind of a 4-state area of North and South Dakota, a little bit of Montana and Wyoming. And they departed on July 2nd, this wagon train, towards the Black Hills. Took them almost 3 weeks to arrive, kind of like we're looking at the Black Hills now. They came in around the west side, which seems kind of odd. There's reasons for that I won't get into right now, but further explained elsewhere. And then they get into the Black Hills. They come down what they called Floral Valley, into the Castle Creek Valley, and eventually camp in there where it says July 30-31. That's the town site of Custer that would be founded a year later. They camped there for 2 nights, and then they moved 3 miles east of Custer, where they stayed for 5 nights. That they called their permanent camp. The permanent camp is where they sent out exploring parties in different directions. One group tried to get to the Badlands. They weren't able to get that far. Another group went down to the Cheyenne River, down by kind of by Edgemont today, and explored that area. Sometime during this week, they went up to Harney Peak, or Black Elk Peak as we call it now. So they're definitely exploring, and the photographer is very busy in this area as well and took a lot of pictures around that general vicinity. And then by August 6th, they're heading back. They get up through the central Black Hills, not quite up as far as Deadwood, but back down through the Nemo Valley, and they finally get out of the Black Hills. They were having a little trouble finding an exit, but they did with all these wagons. And north of Rapid City there, near Black Hawk, they camp near Bear Butte for a couple of nights, and then begin their trek back across the plains towards home again at Fort Lincoln, which takes them about 2 weeks. And they crossed their old trail. They knew where they were. They were just exploring another whole area of upper northwestern South Dakota there and parts of North Dakota as they went back to Fort Lincoln by August 30th. So it's about a 2-month expedition, and only 3 weeks of that are they in the Black Hills. The rest of the time it's travel, to and from the Black Hills. But a lot of interesting stuff happened out on the plains as well. And we know all this because of Captain Ludlow and his map makers who issued this report to Congress in 1875. It's got 3 maps that fold out of the back, and you scan these in or get your magnifying glass out and start looking at it. And there's a lot of detail. The route of the expedition is shown with arrows going whichever direction they were traveling. Over on the left there, you can see they went both directions in that little section of trail as they went back, as I explained a minute ago. And then they went up Black Elk Peak, but not with the wagons. That's just a reconnaissance, as they called it, one of those explorations, which they went on horseback. So, 20-some years ago, Ernie Graffy, my co-author, this was his part of the book, was trying to kind of fit this expedition map to modern topographic maps. And it helped that we know where some of these locations are. You've got kind of a base to start doing this. And the expedition map isn't, by any means 100% accurate, but you could get the gist of which way they were going and start to put that into the modern world just a little bit. And going along with the map, then we have, I think we're up to 25 written sources now. These are generally people who were right there when this was going on, writing stuff down. So Newton Winchell was the chief geologist of this expedition. He founded the geology department at the University of Minnesota, and they have his papers, and they have this wonderful diary that he kept as he used it to write his official report to Congress. But there's a lot more in the diary, including some sketches, pretty nice sketches. And this says Granite Hills outline looking east. And there's also a description of coming into view of this range of mountains as they came into the area where the town of Custer is now. And on July 30th is when they arrived there, and so this sketch was done apparently on July 30th. It's on that page right across from that diary entry, and so we were wondering if we could figure out what he had sketched, and we look at the map, and you can see the dates there where they arrived on July 30th, where the town site is of Custer, and so we're kind of going back up that trail, and I'm making it sound a little more dramatic than it really was, but it was pretty obvious just north of Custer there, which is where we assumed the route was, and the map shows. You could see these rock formations just north of the town of Custer, about halfway to Crazy Horse Memorial. If you've driven north out of Custer and gone to Crazy Horse, you can see these out the window on the right side, part of the Buckhorn Range. If I go to the end of my driveway and kind of go like this, I can see these rocks across the valley. That's one of the reasons I got interested in this subject. The photographer also took a view of these rocks from another angle. I shot this picture, looking at those formations, and if you move left or right, even a quarter mile, half a mile, those rock formations kind of shift like this, and so I'm trying to find that one spot, and much like the photos, I'm pretty sure he was, within a few hundred yards, certainly, of where I was standing, again, north of Custer there, about where Heritage Village is, if you happen to know where that feature is up there. But so the photographer, William Henry Illingworth, was shooting in stereo for the most part. He titled his pictures on the back, Stereographs of the Black Hills. That's printed on the back of these stereo views. Series of 800 through 854 was the numbering he used. This isn't his camera. I wish we had a picture of his camera or a photo of him with it. We haven't come across anything like that, but this is a typical 1870s wet plate camera, and I know we're going to hear more about this afternoon. I'm really looking forward to that from Shane. I'm going to give you just the gist of what I understand as a non-practicer, but looking at this in books and so on. The stereo camera had 2 lenses because he's shooting 2 pictures side by side on a piece of glass, and he would coat that glass with some chemistry that in a dark tint, and then get that ready, put it into a holder, put the holder into the camera, take out the dark slide, and then merely take off the lens caps. There wasn't a shutter button. You just took the lens caps off and count to maybe 10 or 15 seconds exposure time, and then put the lens caps back on, put the dark slide back in, process that negative, and you'd have a picture that you had to somehow not break in the next 1,000 miles, in a wagon train. But they're about 8 inches wide, and this is, of course, one from the archives here in Pierre at the State Historical Society that I've been able to look at a couple of times. It's a joy, of course, for me to do that. And so these are about 8 inches wide, about 4.5 inches tall. You can see the 2 photos on one piece of glass here. And so Illingworth would then print these to these stereo views. And I call this a history of the negatives, and it's really just a very abbreviated history. And this is new material that I don't normally present. I added this for this session especially. So there could be more to this that I don't know about. I want to be clear about that. But we do know that he took around 70 expedition photos. Some are near duplicate. So sometimes he took one stereo shot and then he took another one of the same location. We'll see that in the moment here. In that number, the number that are in the State Archives collection, there are a couple of photos of Minnesota that got mixed in with the Black Hills negatives when those came to Pierre. And we finally proved those are of Minnesota. They're not of the Black Hills, even though for probably 100 years people thought that they probably were of the Black Hills, and we were able to sort that out eventually. He produced an unknown number of these stereo view cards. They're quite collectible. My friend Bob Colby is with us here today, and he and I have traded a lot of information about Illingworth and traded in a few stereo views as well. But you can find these on the collector's market. They're in value $100 to maybe $3,000 for some of the more valuable ones. So they're really interesting to collect, and I've got quite a few as well. There's a set of 55 views altogether, and that's sort of the holy grail to get a whole collection, but difficult to do. These are on display out at the Journey Museum in Rapid City. They also have a pretty complete set. And why was he shooting this format? It was to put them into these viewers, and I'm sure looking around this room, I'm guessing quite a few of you have come across these before, these stereo opticon viewers, as they called them. Back in the 1800s, this is what you did without, you didn't have radio or TV or any of that stuff. So you'd learn about the world by looking at the work of photographers who were shooting in this format all over the planet, really. And so that's what he was doing. In 1900, Minnesota historian Edward Bromley purchased Illingworth's life work from his estate, from his son. And this would have been hundreds of negatives, like 1,600, 1,800 glass plate negatives, including the Black Hills negatives. So this was 7 years after Illingworth died. 20 years went by, but again, before he sold them to South Dakota. But Illingworth, again, had photographed all over the upper Midwest, all across Minnesota, Fort Snelling, St. Paul, of course. He shot pictures of the Northern Pacific Railroad as it was being constructed. He even visited Sioux Falls in 1870. Bob, 70 or 71, we debate that a little bit. But early on, he was in Sioux Falls, Dakota Territory with a guy named Guernsey and took some neat photos of the falls. And it looks a lot like that, except for all the skyscrapers or the buildings going up in the background there. But some of the falls have degraded a little bit over time, and more about that another time. But anyway, so in 1920, Bromley offers the Black Hills negatives in their original box. As he said, this is the box that Illingworth had in 1874 on the expedition. To Doane Robinson, the state historian at that time, who once he got $60 from the legislature, was finally able to buy these. Yeah, just like old times, right? And thank heavens he did. Where they've been, well preserved. Go over 100 years now. So this is the box. It's still got a label on it that says Bromley, St. Paul, Minnesota, or Minneapolis, Minnesota. He was in Minneapolis, actually, and still in the collection. And I was able to photograph this a few years ago with Matthew's help. But I don't know when the first prints were made, except that the first I've come across are out in the School of Mines collection. C.C. O'Hara was the superintendent of the School of Mines, and he was really interested in the Custer expedition in 1924. After 50 years, he's interviewing people like Libby Custer was still alive. Custer's widow was still alive. He wrote letters to her. He was able to talk to people who lived in the Black Hills who had been with Custer 50 years earlier. There's a guy named Windolph who worked at the Homestake Mine, died in 1953. So it's that close, you know. But in any case, there's a lot of good information from O'Hara about the route of the expedition. They could still see wagon ruts and parts of bridges they built and so on in 1924 that we drew on to add to, you know, what we were trying to figure out a few years ago. So the first photos I've seen made from the negatives say Rise Studio, and they're dated, you know, stamped right on the back, 1924. So the negatives were out in Rapid City at some point in time. I've also seen Miller Studio here in Pierre for many years. I've even done business with Miller's before they went out of business. They had the negatives a couple of times and also did this. And then eventually they made some copy negatives and started printing from the copies. But this is a couple of photos from that Yellow Ore, Yellow Hair, Yellow Pine book that I thought were great. And speaking of, you know, pre-Y2K, this is 1972, 73, and the negatives are still in the box. They've done an awesome job for 100 years protecting them. This is Dayton Canaday, then the head of the Historical Society, demonstrating how those negatives were stored vertically in those slots. That's how they lasted so long when Illingworth had them in the wagons. And he may have had other padding or something, but that vertical storage is important. If you store them flat, they can break, you know, under their own weight. By this time, by 1974, obviously they're using glassine envelopes and so on, and I'm sure they got him a pair of white gloves eventually. But that, you know, it was different times, but the negatives remain in remarkable condition. They were digitized originally for the first time, as far as I know anyway, in 2015. As we were approaching the deadlines for this book, I reached out to Matthew Reitzel, and he was so kind to help me scan, or he scanned these for me at my request at a little higher resolution. We got a little more out of them, I think, than had been done earlier with the earlier scans back in 2015. Again, technology marches on. And so you can go in on just these ridiculously small parts of the negatives when they're, you know, Illingworth's best work, sharp and in focus, and see all kinds of stuff that you wouldn't see at a glance looking at these pictures in a book or whatever. This is a blacksmith's wagon. It's a certain tie, and you can even see a bellows on the back of it. The little cart there is an odometer cart that measured the mileage as it went along with the wagon train. You know, these are things we did not know about previously, because this was just sort of an out-of-focus blob in earlier renditions of these photos. Just a little, like it's a satellite surveillance photo here almost, of these guys getting ready for supper. They've rolled into camp, they've set up, they're drying out their blankets, they've got the wagon covers pulled back, they're building a fire, and the arrow is pointing at a guy that I think is gutting out an antelope. I mean, that's what was on the menu. They shot hundreds of antelope as they approached the Black Hills. They talk about how much hunting they were doing. That's what they were eating every night for supper, because it was either that or, you know, hardtack and beans off the wagon probably. So it's just, to me, been amazing and illuminating to see what we can pull out of these now with the digital scans in the modern era here, since Y2K, you might say. A lot of times earlier renditions of these photos would just commonly crop in on them, and there's a lot of stuff around the margins, including this says Hidden Wood Camp. I assume, I don't know this, but that Illingworth inscribed that onto the picture along, as he did with some of the other negatives. He put the titles on, not every single one of them, but you think about it, over his life, he shot, you know, 1,600, 1,800 negatives. He would need to kind of have a filing system. We don't know of any diaries, lists, journals that he kept that explain this further, and you know, those are lost apparently, but if they ever existed. So this is a scan from one of those 1924 images, and we used these in 2001 in our first editions, but now we've updated to the digital scans, and I hope you, maybe I'll just try to jump back here once. Notice the sky, how white that is. That's what we see in a lot of earlier publications of these photos. The sky is always white. And I was always told that photographers of this era couldn't really record the sky because of something to do with blue wavelengths of light and that sort of thing. And we found, to our surprise, with these digital scans and appropriate processing in Photoshop, you can pull that exposure up. It's like burning and dodging, if you know about darkroom stuff, except on a really fine grain scale right around the trees and everything. And all of a sudden we're seeing clouds and even smoke on the horizon if you look carefully in this particular photo. There's a whole story about that in the book. But so that's wonderful. Here's one of the shots that I took. I was trying to, on the same date, or roughly speaking the same date. This is during that period of August 1st through the 5th when they were in one camp, and we don't know exactly what date Illingworth shot all these, but somewhere in that period. Notice the same dead tree here. That's been, subject of many discussions. It's just kind of leaning over now. It's in a canyon there below the cliff there. There's a little teeny tree up at upper right as well that was there in 1874 that's still growing there. It's just gotten maybe a foot or so bigger growing out of that big boulder. So there's a lot of stuff you can unpack in all of these photos once you really start looking at them. So here's Illingworth. I met a descendant of his up in St. Paul, Minnesota back in the early 2000s, Mr. Burlingame, who has passed away now, but he had a family photo album, apparently that belonged to Illingworth or maybe his sister, but it had portraits of the photographer at different times in his life. He was 32 years old at the time of the expedition in 1874. I'm kind of saying that looks like the middle one there. And Mr. Burlingame and I collaborated to get this marker put on Illingworth's grave, which is up in the Oakland Cemetery in St. Paul. So we put pioneer photographer, Custer expedition, Black Hills, 1874. And then he was also on the Fisk expedition to Montana in 1866. Another gold-seeking expedition across North Dakota. He worked with another photographer, and Illingworth and Bill, as I said, and took photos up there, which may have sort of got him on Ludlow's radar for the 1874 expedition. We're not really sure about that, or at least I don't have knowledge on that. Unfortunately, Illingworth was not happy later in his life. He became alcoholic. He had been married 3 times. One of his spouses died. The other 2 were divorces. And so by 1893, there was another panic or downturn in the economy. So he committed suicide on March 17th of 1893. And that's all written up in the papers there, and we get a little more biographical information about him from those sources as well. But obviously his work stands as a legacy to his life and career. We have a biography in our book about Illingworth, and Bob Colby here is also working on a biography along with several other photographers that I'm looking forward to seeing. So, well, just a few photos here finally after that long introduction to what we're doing out in the Black Hills. So we don't have any pictures of Illingworth with his camera or at work, but we do have his shadow at work, at least in a couple of them. And this is just over the border in Wyoming as the expedition was coming into the Black Hills on July 23rd of 1874. As it turned out, I found out about 7:30 in the morning, is when I was there on a July 23rd morning, 2020. You do see changes, the trees and so on that have increased in certain areas, not in all areas, but this is on a private ranch where I had permission from the landowner. And, I actually set up my tripod the day before, did a test shot, left it there overnight just so I'd be ready at the right moment the next morning. I try to take some preparations to make sure these are going to work out, and then you pray for good weather and so on. But the arrow is just kind of pointing at, there's some objects in the photos that you can kind of see at a distance. Some of those are still there. This is a tree stump that's tipped over a tree that died an unknown number of years ago, before 1874, obviously, and it's in pretty much exactly the same position. There's been some erosion in the foreground that has changed, but so that's kind of cool to see. We'll see more about that. So I mentioned Illingworth took 2 photos at some places, and this is an example of that. It's 2 different exposures, probably a minute or 2 apart. I don't know how long it took to change the plates, but you can see a horse herd there disappearing because it moved. Some of the wagons moved. And this is his famous shot of the Castle Creek Valley that's been used on books and magazine covers and so on, kind of symbolic of Western expansion into the Indian territories, of course. And pretty neat spot. The Forest Service has trimmed the trees in the foreground. That was dense forest 25 years ago, like the background is sort of dense forest, although that has changed with the mountain pine beetle epidemic recently. But we've also got something hiding up in the corner here, And I was so tickled to see Shane's, I think that's part of Shane's processing box back there that he'll probably be demonstrating later. And that's what we're looking at here is Illingworth's dark tent. It's obviously a man-made object, and I remember seeing this on the photo and just kind of going, there's a little chip in the negative or something, I didn't know what it was. We get to looking at it under magnification and realizing it's a folding box. There's a black cloth on there. So this is part of his apparatus, and it's the only glimpse of that we get anywhere that I'm aware of. So kind of interesting to see that. Another thing that comes up in this photo are these tree stumps again, and it's been remarked on many times. This is the shot on the cover of the book. The same tree stump there since 1874. And my good friend Blaine Cook, who was the chief forester of the Black Hills National Forest, wanted to try to figure out how old these were. There's a couple of ways to do that, but they mostly avoid, you have to cut the tree down to get the tree rings or do a core sample. But he chose to look behind the camera point. So if you turn around, here are these other stumps, very similar to the ones in the front of the camera. They're all from the same fire event, whenever that was. And so he cut one of those, which is now on exhibit in the Forest Service office in Custer. They took the tree rings and sent them to a lab down in Colorado, and where they can scientifically date these with 100% accuracy. And they found that tree sprouted in 1418. The outer rings date to 1570, but some of the rings burned off, so that's the newest one. Probably died in a 1685 fire. And if that's true, it's been standing for 340 years. In any case, it's 605-year-old stump that's standing behind the camera point, and the one in the front, all of those in the front are probably of a similar age. So great to have that sort of information. And that's kind of what I mentioned earlier, that people from other disciplines look at these. I'm just trying to match them up, and I want to explain a little bit, but I'm always interested in what other people can pull out of this stuff. So that's good stuff. This is a photo pair I did back in 2001. I shot on film back then. I used a medium format film, which was, impossibly difficult compared to the way it is now. But you'd shoot and, you're kind of just eyeballing it. There was really no way to compare the accuracy in the field, as far as I could find out anyway. So the forest was much denser back then, as some of you recall, in the Black Hills. And a lot of times I was just looking for a little window like that. I mean, this is like the only place I could see those mountains at sort of the same perspective as in the old photo. And the slope looked pretty good, so I convinced myself, well, this is probably close to the spot. I don't know, but this is what we're going to go with because it's the best I could do at the time. And now we fast forward a few years, and in 2020, notice on the right that the trees are much thinner. You can see into the forest, and there's a couple of dead trees there. Those are mountain pine beetle killed trees. What happened was the mountain pine beetle would kill the tree, and then you got about a year to cut it before it starts to rot if you want to preserve the timber. And so they were definitely trying to salvage a lot of these. So some of these areas also got logged near Custer and elsewhere across the Black Hills. So I realized I was not at the right spot back in 2001. I was down on that ridge in the middle ground there, that little ridge you can see through the trees, and I kept backing up, and I finally back up and I see this rock that the arrows are pointing at, and again, that's an obvious indicator that we're very close to the actual photo site. And these are those same rocks that were in the sketch that I showed a little bit ago, and north of Custer, South Dakota. So yeah, that's a great photo site to kind of illustrate this cycle with the forest. Well, Ludlow, the map maker, was interested in going to the highest points. He went to the top of Bear Butte and the top of Indian Cara, and he's always looking for high points because he's doing his mapping from there. He's shooting bearings at other mountains and tying his map together, along with taking latitude and longitude readings and so on. So on July 31st, Custer says, Ludlow, whatever you want to do, we'll go up, we'll climb Black Elk Peak, Harney Peak as they called it. So they take off with a company of cavalry from the campsite at lower left there, where they left on July 31st, 1874. They took horses. They didn't take the wagon train. Just went up to Black Elk Peak. The arrows there kind of show their two routes. And they got up to near the top. They thought they were going to the top. They get to number 1 there, thinking that's the high point. That's what they could see up above them. And this is all described in various accounts very clearly. They reach that and go, yay, we're up on Harney Peak. And then they go, oh, wait a minute, there's this other hill, number 2, a little taller, so we'll hike up there or ride up there, which they did. And then suddenly they see the total mass of Harney Peak or Black Elk Peak, as some of you probably have when you hike out there. And it's obvious that's the mountain that you need to get up. So by late afternoon, maybe even early evening, they're up at near the summit of what we call Black Elk Peak today. They didn't quite get to the very summit, but they were just below it. But that takes a long time. The sun is setting, so they have to ride back then pretty much in the dark at some point. They get back to camp at 1 o'clock in the morning of August 1st, 1874. So Custer later wrote to his wife, there has not been a single card party nor a drunken officer since we left Fort Lincoln, which sounds really good. I think it's a little bit of a stretcher, but and you do have to say, at least these guys are not playing cards. So that part was true. And I don't know if they're drunk yet either, but there is this champagne supper, and this took place, coincidence or not, on what date? July 31st, while Custer was up on Black Elk Peak. But a number of the primary officers, and they're all identified in the book. President Grant's son, Fred Grant, is the guy at Wright. I'll just mention that. But he came along on this expedition. So the whole party were pretty well hobbled, as it says here, before the end of the evening. I will say also, we colorized this photo. We did that for the book. Matthew and I had talked about this, and he wanted me to make sure everybody knows the Historical Society doesn't do that. And, there's a controversy about whether you should colorize historic photos, and I totally respect that. I just think it really brings some things out that you might not notice in black and white, like the cigar box and so on. But and we'll have some other examples of that, their buttons and so on. So this photo site was elusive, to say the least. Back in 2001, I kind of took a shot at it. We know they were camped where the town of Custer is today, so I was trying to, look around, but on the ground. But by 2020, certainly, or actually in the early 2000s, we had Google Earth emerge as a technology that anybody could get at, including somebody like me on my home computer. So 2020, I'm searching across Google Earth around the town of Custer, looking into corners that I hadn't looked in before from ground level, and identifying rock formations that I would then mark and then go hiking out there. And I came to this spot, which started to look good to me over time, that I thought could be the location. It's right next to the Mickelson Trail on the north edge of town. The Mickelson Trail is that little thing on the right there, which was a railroad line, of course, at one time. So they did, during construction, may have done some damage to this area. I'm not really sure. The rock formations in the foreground don't match exactly, but they have the same kind of configuration. There's a lot of pine needles coming down every year. I see rocks in my backyard just get buried in a season or two by pine needles coming down from the trees above. So I'm not saying this is it, but it's about a block from where I thought it was in 2001. This is about a block over. The background, I think, is probably pretty much correct, but I got more about that in the book. But the other tantalizing possible clue is this tree, which today there's a tree stump that has kind of a similar configuration there as well, and it's a pretty unusual shape. So I'm about 80% sold on this. We threw it out in the book, and I'm being careful not to say this is absolutely it. Game Fish and Parks has jurisdiction over the right-of-way along the trail, and I did make a proposal with a licensed archaeologist who does work for the state and the feds, and else, she's qualified. Yeah, and but they declined to let her do that, so we don't have any archaeological evidence yet to confirm or deny this, and maybe that'll happen. I was disappointed about that, but if anybody's got any insights on that, I would love to hear about it. So Illingworth gets busy. As it says here, on August 2nd, he was assigned 10 men, soldiers, to go with him, taking 2 days' rations, and Illingworth was hoping to add 15 or 20 views to the photos he had already taken. And so this is going to go a little faster. I'm backing down the trail a little ways here just to give you a glimpse at a number of these photo sites. And again, there's about 50 of them around the Black Hills, a few more out on the prairie that are in the other book. This is up near Deerfield Lake, that area. This is north of Custer as they came that direction. Again, north of Custer, just north of Crazy Horse Memorial, actually. This is on private land, but north of Crazy Horse. North of Crazy Horse up on the Forest Service. Anybody can hike to that one or this one. Up by the Needles now. We're kind of northeast of Custer here. Mountain pine beetle is evident here and there as you look at these. I'll slow it down here for just a second. This is, it's hard to explain, but on the right, this was just a dense forest. I could have put a picture in of a bunch of tree trunks, and that's what it looked like in 2001. Some of them very tiny and small, some of them large, very dense forest, but the mountain pine beetle killed millions of trees in the Black Hills, and then a lot of them were logged. So this area was logged as well as mountain pine beetle, which turned it into essentially a meadow. The grass starts growing, and then now we have the next generation of trees coming up. But as the arrows indicate, again, I'm triangulating from the background to this location, and I finally went, that can't be that little rock that I'm seeing. And, I didn't even hardly notice it in Illingworth's photo, but that is definitely the site. And then we don't have glass negatives of every one of his photos. They've either disappeared or never were transferred to the State Historical Society back in 1920. And this is an example where we have to use Illingworth's original stereo view because that's all we have. So we're always kind of watching for these negatives to show up in a collection in Minnesota or something like that. And this is just east of Custer near Calamity Peak during the motorcycle rally because that's August 1st through the 5th out there, right? But so lots of bikes riding around. And here we are at Calamity Peak looking down at the campsite of the expedition from August 1st through the 5th. You can just kind of see some tents there. That's the same live tree growing out of the top of Calamity Peak. Very interesting how old that must be. Down at a much easier level to reach is this boulder formation that's just off of a roadway east of Custer. Again, the camp in the background there where they stayed for 5 days. Also French Creek, where gold was discovered, is right in that area. And again, the fabulous clouds that were really not seen in earlier renditions of that photo. And then that picture was taken just across the valley. You're looking at the site from here, but then he crossed this valley, climbed this high rock, and we're looking now towards Harney Peak or Black Elk Peak, and the camp was spread out below, as you see in 1874. Highway 16A runs from Custer on the left into Custer State Park on the right. If you've ever driven from Custer to Custer State Park, Stockade Lake, you're going right through this campsite, okay? And in July, as Kevin alluded to, we're going to commemorate the 150th anniversary of this expedition, and we have permission from the private landowner who owns that pasture that's right in the foreground there. Mr. Gaussman is giving us permission from the Custer County Historical Society and the museum, as well as Black Hills State Case Library for Western Historical Studies Scholarship Fund. We will be running a fundraiser for them. It's a free event. We're going to have some speakers in the morning at the high school. You may hear something similar to this program at the high school that day, as well as Dr. David Wolf from Black Hills State talking about the history of the gold rush, and Whitney Rencounter from Crazy Horse Memorial is also going to speak about the Dakota perspective on all of this. So out at the camp then, after those morning events on July 21st, we'll have reenactors, gold panning, and some fun stuff like that. Not a huge, Buffalo Roundup type festival by any means. It's just going to be kind of a low key, but we do want to commemorate this historic time. So that's going to be held right on the site. As I said, it's free admission, and we are taking sponsorships and donorships. Deadwood History has already made us financially solvent, and we really appreciate that. So now we can rent those porta potties and pay some people that are coming in to reenact and so on. And no, seriously, this is a volunteer effort. I'm totally volunteer along with David Wolf and others who are working on this to make it a historic and hopefully fun event for people. So ask me about that if you have any questions about a sponsorship later. So we couldn't finish this up without looking at the photo of the grizzly bear, which, as one of the officers wrote, was taken at their camp of August 7th, 1874. And we did colorize this one as well. We left one version not colored and another one colored in the book. But then you see the dog laying at the left there. You see the hat device on Captain Ludlow's hat on the right. It's really brings it to life in sort of a nostalgic way, I think. I was there on August 7th, again, 2020. And watching the shadow on that rock formation in the foreground, just kind of waiting for it to creep over, and about 6:15, I think it was, p.m., that seemed to be about the time of the 1874 photo. So the last picture Illingworth took out at Bear Butte in the Black Hills area, at least that was his last picture. This is also on a private ranch, but you can drive by and kind of get the gist of that pretty readily. So again, the suppression of natural fire caused by lightning is what caused the forest to become denser up in the Black Hills, and also out on the prairie we're seeing more trees as well. So just a few quick shots here of the book itself, again, and also a glimpse into the expedition photos. This picture that Illingworth took of the camp, just a fabulous photo taken east of the present-day town of Custer with French Creek there and the smoke from the campfires and so on. Another addition to our new volume is a 3-page essay by Jace Dakota, who was the professor of American Indian Studies at Black Hills State University for a long time. I'd heard her speak at a couple of conferences, and I really wanted to bring that voice, a voice like that, into our book, and that has Custer on the cover, you know. And so she graciously agreed to do that, wrote this in August of 2022. She passed away in November of 2022, but of course we did publish the essay just as she wrote it, so really pleased to have that part of this. And Ernie and I, as we were working on the updated edition, came across some things. In some cases, the mountain pine beetle has really been my friend. I mean, it killed a lot of trees, but it's opened up the forest, made it more natural, and that revealed in some cases to us these wagon ruts, for example, which we believe originated with the Custer expedition. So that's something we didn't know about back in 2001, or we missed. There's also pictures of signage and other historic areas around the Black Hills that we did not have photos of earlier. We've got photos of all the museums that have expedition artifacts in them, so you can take all those in one trip around the Black Hills if you'd like. And then I also got permission from SDSU to print a few of their 1974 photos from that earlier book. So we have 1874, 1974, 2002, my film version, and then 2020, the digital version I shot more recently. So that is what is in there. I'm not sure if there's any of these out on the tables here or anything, but I do have a few in my car if anybody's interested. I didn't come here to sell books necessarily, but otherwise please go online and I'll show you my website here in a minute and I can help you out with that. So people ask, what am I working on right now? And this has been what I've been working on for about 10 years, but I am working on it right now a little more intently with thanks to Bob Colby and the archives providing these wonderful historic photos. I'm trying to do this across the state of South Dakota now. It has challenges, but anytime I can get a little bit of an elevation or some object that's up in the air a little bit, you can start to marry those together, past and present, and you see the changes with the trees, the changes in the landscape, and places like downtowns of various places, overlooks and landmarks. I'm looking for any kind of material like this. This is at Chamberlain. It's just really striking. The dams were built. That filled up the river. The bridges got moved. I'm just telling you what you're going to see. And then the pretty amazing growth of juniper and these trees, you know, along the banks of the Missouri River, which I also see elsewhere, really have changed that environment. This was in South Dakota Magazine last issue. And then at Sioux Falls, the waterfall and the Queen Bee Mill there that burned down in 1956. And I'm pointing at the window there because we'll need that in a second here. But that picture here was taken probably from that window. So how do you shoot that? Well, it took me a while for the light bulb to go on, but you go get your license to fly a drone and permission from the FAA to fly under the flight path into Sioux Falls. And the problem with Sioux Falls is you have to go back every 3 months and shoot the skyline again because it's changed already since I shot this last spring. And then just yesterday, coming towards Pier, I had my eye on this. I got this picture from a descendant of the man who built this garage. And you probably recognize this along Highway 14 there, just west of Midland. So that's the kind of thing I'm looking for, glimpses of the past, places where it's changed or not, as the case may be. So I do put that stuff out on Facebook, got the website, of course, that's just my name. Ask me, I'll give you my card if you'd like that. And yeah, we do appreciate the purchase of our books. That's what keeps this thing going here for what it's worth. And I should say I have a final historic photo here, deep from the archives, way before Y2K, back when I still had a lot of hair. This is more like 1980s, yeah, a young aspiring photographer at the Brandon Valley Reporter over there by Sioux Falls. So, well, I appreciate your attention today. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you again for the invite. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. Now, I believe we'll take a few minutes of questions and let me know when we need to wrap this up. But if anybody does have any questions, I will do my best to answer those as best I can. And did you want to come on up? Yes, by all means. Yeah. Oh, there's one.
Hi, I'm Jean Kessler.
Yes,
from
Jean.
Rapid City.
Nice to see you.
And I got to ask, Valentine McGillicuddy.
Yes. I have, in regards to, yeah, I'll definitely have a photo of Valentine McGillicuddy, the first man to successfully get to the summit of Black Elk Peak. And yes, well, Gene is involved with restoring the house that he had in Rapid City, which is wonderful. And yeah, I've got pictures of, he'll definitely be in this South Dakota book. He's already in our Black Hills book.
Right.
Right. And so there's wonderful photos that were taken in 1875, which are even more rare than the photos taken in 1874. They've also got copies of those in the state archives. So yeah, there's a great shot of him up on top of Black Elk Peak with his surveying instrument. And I actually have a whole program about that that we should get together on sometime.
Thank you.
You bet. Bob Colby there has got a question, yeah. This one's going to make me nervous because Bob knows Illingworth, so.
As per the champagne party,
Yes.
my interpretation of that photograph. Sutlers went along with this group, and the Sutler was a civilian 7-Eleven.
Yeah.
They had everything that the U.S. government wouldn't sell. That's where they got the liquor, because he had it in stock.
Undoubtedly.
And you saw on the lower right corner of the champagne party a guy by the name of Frederick Dent Grant. Frederick, the first name, Dent is his mother's maiden name, and Grant is his father's name, and his father was U.S. Grant. I don't remember if Grant was a lieutenant colonel or colonel at that point. I mean, it's close.
Yeah.
But Lieutenant Colonel Custer was not a favored person of the President U.S. Grant. Custer wanted the expedition, went to Washington to solicit Grant's simsalabim and all that good stuff. Grant gave it to him, but never met with him. Probably the reason Frederick Dent Grant went along was to keep the eyes on Lieutenant Colonel Custer, who was not a favorite of the U.S.
Yeah.
President.
Nobody was keeping an eye on Fred Grant.
Yes. And Fred Grant had the same penchant toward fruit of the vine as his father.
Dad did.
And he was there enjoying the libations of the afternoon while Lieutenant Colonel Custer was out climbing the mountain.
Right. Thanks, Bob. Yep. All true. I think if it ain't true, it ought to be. So, yep. Anybody other questions? Well, I'll be happy to visit at the break or any other time. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead. Yeah, if you got a question.
So this obviously represents a ton of work on your part, and I know it's a big passion project for
Yes,
you.
absolutely.
But is there a part of the whole process, whether it's researching or like going out and taking the photos, that's your absolute favorite?
Yeah, it's like a treasure hunt, really. I mean, I compare it to that. Getting to the site and what am I going to find? I'm pretty excited at that point. And will it work? Will it match up? Or will there be a bunch of trees in the way? I mean, that's just something I run into. And then I've had to throw pictures out for that reason. Or maybe you can find an angle that looks close enough. But yeah, that's probably what I sort of live for. But I also really enjoy sharing them in these live presentations almost as much as in the books, because this is a large screen and I like that. But yeah, finding the site is definitely what motivates me, and what will be the same and what's changed and what can we get out of that. So yeah, thanks. But it's all fun. It is fun. It's a lot of work, but it is fun at times. Yep. All right. Very good. Well, I do have to leave tonight because, as I said earlier, I'm flying down to see my in-laws, and an eclipse, in that order, I guess. We're leaving Saturday morning, so I apologize for not being here tomorrow, but I'll be here through the early part of the reception tonight and look forward to speaking to anybody who has a question or comment. So thank you. Thanks again. Thank you. Thank you. Appreciate it. Thanks.